Hello everyone, today we go back on German history and more specifically the rise of the Swabian dynasty. So we are in the first half of the 12th century, a very important moment in European history, rather than only the German one. A moment that was crucial because Europe was quite speedily fast-forwarding in under many points of view, and yet the political institutions were sometimes incapable of controlling this expansion. The history of Germany is obviously the history of the Holy Roman Empire, and this institution that we will see it, but this is pretty much notorious, that was the most prestigious one of Western Christianity, but at the same time also weak. The same Kingdom of France was fastly rising, way more than the Kingdom of Germany in power, although the Swabian dynasty of the Hohenstaufen actually had the chance to compete at least with that. Eventually they failed, but I think the Hohenstaufen history is in many ways the real core of the Middle Ages. It's we can say that together with it, a part of European history finished. Also for other reasons that now we can't periodize with excessive pickiness, but we can say that the history of the 14th and 15th century in Europe are quite different from the 13th century. That was the peak of universalism that was embodied by the same chances of the Holy Roman Empire to become essentially a universal empire into not just into Western Europe but also into the East, also because in that century the Byzantine Empire gets basically destroyed. And eventually it kind of rises again, but in very different form. And in this sense, the end of the Hohenstaufen dynasty is definitely important as much as the beginning that we will see today, because things could really go in another direction if the same rise of the Hohenstaufen is really something quite rapid, considering that in the Holy Roman Empire, even if you see the Habsburgs or other families, their rise that eventually became quite important and even rose to the imperial dignity was sometimes quite fortunate, quite rapid indeed. But without talking too much about it, we will explain it later. First of all, I think it's important to give an overall picture of the imperial institution. Let's say that at the beginning of the 12th century, Germany was a kingdom within the Holy Roman Empire that encompassed other lands as well, but it was kind of the core land of the Holy Roman Empire. Yet it was politically fragmented. It was essentially at that time made up of 4 great duchies. There were many more. So it isn't that it was Germany was exactly split into that. Germany was already it was already quite fragmented even before the importation of French feudalism that the Hohenstaufen actually did in the middle of the century. There were many autonomous aristocracies, different, a very composite political landscape indeed. And these 4 duchies are usually defined as ethnic duchies because they corresponded originally to, and quite roughly, to 4 peoples of Germanic origin that had dwelled into this area. and namely the Bavarians, the Saxons, the Franconians, and the Swabians. These are kind of four repartitions that go really beyond the ethnic base, in the sense that, originally speaking, indeed, there were peoples inhabiting Germany divided more or less into these areas. But there are, and the reason was also geographical, in the sense that the forests, usually great German forests, divided these regions, so that's the reason why those peoples remained kind of separated into this fashion. But at this time, the ethnic base is really nominal in many ways. Those who are ruling here are not peoples, are aristocracies that intermarried intensely among each other within themselves, and that had far long ties with, not just with other German aristocracy, but also with other international powers. Take France, Burgundy, Bohemia, Italy, and indeed, we're talking about a world that was speeding up towards a further fragmentation of these units. But generally speaking, the dukes that ruled over these ensembles were those who held the major power in Germany. As we all know, and we already explained in our videos, the royal crown in Germany was elective, and even though there was really no formal sanction to this, it was a political practice that also stemmed from the Germanic tradition, but that had taken a kind of a pragmatic route by itself, because it's obvious that if central power is weak, those who want to rise to the top have to be backed by those who have power from the bottom, in this sense. The king of Germany was normally elected by these dukes. Sometimes, obviously, first of all, the king was usually one of these dukes himself, obviously, but it was kind of normal. Basically, in every monarch that was elected, that someone eventually turned against him, or that during the election he didn't get the full the support of all the other dukes. So there was a lot of infight between the German aristocracies in this sense. But being nominated King of Germany was something more important than just being a German king, because that was the first step in order to reach the imperial title. The norm was that the newly crowned German king would be crowned once again in Aachen, or sometimes also in other usually it was Aachen, but I think I saw at least once, but it happens surely multiple times, crownings also elsewhere. Usually the crowning of these figures was along the most developed areas of Germany, like along the Rhine, in cities like Mainz, or even a bit more distance like Frankfurt. I mean, developed centers that in this sense represented a bit Germany as a whole, even though sometimes these places were siding obviously with those who had to be crowned, and other people didn't want that. So it was a pretty messy situation, and usually in Aachen the German king was crowned as King of the Romans, which basically was an emperor wannabe, in the sense that he was basically felt as eligible to the imperial title, and it was a kind of let's say of I can't say about strengthening of the of his own authority, in the sense that the imperial crown was not tied to Germany itself. So even if, as we will see, the imperial crown was not to be given to these kings, they still said, well, okay, but we're, however, kings of the Romans, so we own this title that basically puts us, politically speaking, on an higher step in front of let's say of Europe, broadly meant at this point, since the universalistic ambitions were fastly growing in spite of all the difficulties that surrounded these elections. So after this, the kingdom of the Romans now had to go into Italy to take the Italian crown. This was very important because it was basically settled in definitely in late Carolingian times. So these weren't really rules written anywhere, but the single local political entities obviously considered that as a must, because they could obviously interfere into the process, but this still reflected an actual necessity of the aspirant emperor to interact with certain other authorities. The Kingdom of Italy was necessary because it was the kingdom into which the Pope was present. So since the Roman Emperor had to defend the Pope and the Church of Rome, he had to take also the Italian crown before getting to Rome and getting crowned as Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope himself. And in all this, as you can see also from the map, the Holy Roman Empire had extended since, say, through the 10th and 11th century, during the Saxon, the Ottonian and the Salian times, also into Italy and Burgundy, as a real, let's say, in really practical terms, in the sense that Italy was theoretically part of the empire, but for a long time it had remained very out of the grip of German or French powers. From the Ottonian times, Italy was at least nominally brought under German rule, and so Burgundy here. There is also the Duchy of Bohemia that eventually became a kingdom on its own, and you see also here in the northeast all these kind of Germanized Slavic territories that were practically being absorbed by the same Roman Empire. Now the problem is that the control over these lands really passed through the success of the single German duke to pass through essentially all this complicated ladder that obviously saw obstacle after obstacle, because there was never a full agreement from in the empire towards the figure of anyone at the top. So all great problems. But indeed, once having nominated emperor, the power of these figures was very big, and it could lead to further extension of the same imperial borders and especially an internal strengthening of the political and of the same imperial institutions, so that the next elected king would have been not just a guy elected by the German nobility, but also someone who had a substantial power on its own. We should premise also that at this point the imperial authority was coming out defeated from the struggle of investitures with the papacy. So there was a lot also of ecclesiastical influence in the of papal interest influence, say better, in the affairs of Germany. Something that also tied the imperial policy to at least the relation that that it had with the papal one, the let's say let's say a better term, the harmony, let's say the concord. Concord is the best word with the Pope. And so at this point, even German monarchy had been weakened substantially, because when the struggle of investitures had taken place, many this event had been seen by from the German aristocracies to rightfully rebel against imperial rule by simply saying, oh, okay, we side with the Pope, even if they didn't care anything about the Pope, just for fighting against the in contrast with the centralizing push that the emperor was usually carrying out once that he had been elected. And naturally you have to think that the base of the emperor remained the old duchy of origin, so they definitely had also a substantial power on their own, but it's still difficult to fight against everyone at a point. So the history of the Hohenstaufen is really looking at how the German monarchy got partially out of this impasse. I say partially because the whole imperial institutions basically remained with all their their faults, let's say, from a centralistic perspective. The only one who could actively change them in practice was Frederick I, so Hohenstaufen, but he didn't manage to, for more than one reason, but we're not going to discuss it today. Eventually, even under Frederick II, the general attitude was definitely to try a certain form of centralization, but from the other side also granting more power to the other part of the aristocracy, at least. This kind of sounds schizophrenic, but the explanation is that this usually happened still on a local scale, in the sense that certain major German aristocrats were maybe in this sense granted rights by the emperor, and because they were too strong and to actively fight against them, and also because they could give something in turn. Other areas where maybe some noble lineages had died out, or into which the situation was more fragmentary, well, those were usually the areas into which the emperors would try to expand their own. At that point we can say their own personal power, because in practice the imperial position was used also to increase not just the decentralizing institutions, but also in order to strengthen the private assets of the duchy from which the emperor was originary of. So as we see, and the situation was also more complicated, because at this time, as I was saying at the beginning, Europe was really on the rise, and the German cities, especially in the Rhine Valley, were really expanding fast, and sometimes even managing to carry out an independent policy from the central power that was backed by the bishops that ruled over them. That's the reason why eventually certain ecclesiastical let's say electors became German and political affairs, including especially the obviously the same election. Indeed, sorry, I was distracted by something. But really starting to tell the story here, at the death of Henry V, that had occurred, if I'm not wrong, in 1125, there was a further impasse. Henry V was the fourth and last ruler of the Salian dynasty, so he basically had embodied the apex of the imperial defeat in front of the papacy, because with the Concordat of Worms, basically, yeah, it wasn't a complete imperial defeat, but it was basically the sanctioning of the papal prerogatives after the Gregorian reforms. So the and as we've seen, the central power had grown weakened in this sense. So this was part of the reason why there was not an agreement on the election of the next king. So the German nobility was practically split, to make it simple, into two factions. One was favorable to the Dukes of Bavaria, and it was called Guelph, or Guelph is really an Italianization of the term, that because the Italians eventually had a great they participated to this division and made it kind of more famous than it was in Germany itself. But the whole thing originated into Germany, and simply Guelph had been the family the founder of the ducal Bavarian family. So that's what the name where the name comes from. Another faction that instead was guided by the Dukes of Swabia, who instead had kind of inherited the Salian policy of the House of Franconia, that was called Ghibelline. Also in here, the name comes from the castle of Weiblingen. That was one of the most important centers that was held by the Hohenstaufen family. The reason why the Hohenstaufen were following the Salian policy in this sense was that they had inherited it. They had tried with the extinction of the Salian dynasty to take its place, and this had been achieved actually thanks to the same backing of the Salian dynasty. The Emperor Henry IV had been the one who entrusted to the Hohenstaufen the Duchy of Swabia. This happened because in the harshest times of the struggle for investitures, the Hohenstaufen had basically remained the only ones faithful to Henry IV, who had eventually given his daughter into as a wife to the Hohenstaufen, and therefore they really felt like the heirs of the Salians. And you can even see here from from the map that there is definitely a geographical continuity between Swabia and Franconia, while the Saxony and Bavaria were separated but still kind of bordering with the other two duchies. So there is a kind of an axis that gets formed that is not really you can ideally think it as an axis of sort. It's not that Bavarians or Saxons had much in common, but they're enemies. And the rise of the Hohenstaufen, in this sense, was seen as a threat to their policies. So the title of the king of Germany was, however, and therefore of emperor, was eventually attributed to Lothar of Supplenburg, that was Duke of Saxony, that was backed by the Bavarians. And Lothar reigned from, actually not a short reign, from 1125 to 1137. However, he wasn't very appreciated by the German nobility. First of all, because he seemed to be a little too soft and flexible with Pope Innocent II. That he defended when the Pope got in contrast with the Norman Duke Roger, who had claimed himself as King of Sicily, because Sicily was considered a papal fief, and therefore the Pope didn't like that someone could really rise to unallowed title without his approval. But another very important thing that made the German aristocracy pretty angry was that Lothar basically gave up the rights of the inheritance of the Marquess Matilda of Tuscany had left to the church. We will talk about Matilda of Tuscany sooner or later, but and we don't. It's a pretty complicated story. But let's say that Matilda was the heiress of a huge fortune that of properties that stretched from across northern and southern and central Italy. She had a great role into the struggle for investitures, because she had backed the church and all, even though she was kind of even she was I can't find the terms in English today. Let's say married into, not really, but let's say that she had ties with the imperial family. So, and she was herself a feudatory of the empire. So her property was not really hers into the feudal perspective, in the sense that an imperial fief could not be freely ceded or given to someone without through a testament, because the feudal properties belonged, at least in the possession plan, because her properties were not really her properties, but she simply possessed them in the name of the empire. So very complicated story, but Lothar kind of accepted that the church could extend its power on those lands, which were, by the way, very important in this sense for the control of Italy itself, that had been controlling Italy had been since the time of the Teutonians, and then through the Salians, the main goal of the German emperors, because it was the wealthiest land of the empire, was the one also more politically fragmented, so it was a kind of a juicy prey, but also the people who lived in there kind of opposed the imperial rule as long as it became too heavy and too demanding. And as we've seen, there were even there Italian aristocracies that absolutely didn't like the centralizing push as much as the the German ones. And so in 1237 the German nobles eventually chose the opposite side of the Welfen by electing Conrad of Hohenstaufen, the Duke of Swabia. So you can see even here how the political balance worked, in the sense that it wasn't really anything dogmatic or based on particular sides. This idea of the Welfs and the Ghibellines was relatively blurred in part, at least when it came to the let's say to the broader German picture. The election could choose one or the other with great infight, obviously of the same sides, but it was not really everything on them, decided by them. And this proves, by the way, how still this German crown was really in the hands of the aristocracy. But Conrad was also pretty delusional in this sense, because he, first of all, there was also a need of peace, largely, in the sense that the imperial rule had not been created just for, by some and especially wasn't standing on its feet still, because someone had decided to impose a kind of universalistic power and all. In medieval perspective, but also in quite a pragmatical one, the emperor was conceived as an authority that had to bring order and justice and all these things. So the German aristocracies were favorable in many occasions, like this one, to vote for a chief that had essentially to keep things in order, but without, from the other side, expanding too much into private business. There is constantly this form of balancement, and he wasn't that able to pacificate Germany, pacify Germany, and especially he undertook this enterprise of the Second Crusade, the Shame of Damascus, as it was called, famously. The Second Crusade was fought between 1147 and 1149. It was a major expedition that was made up chiefly by the German and the French. By the way, this was the first crusade into which two kings basically participated, the major ones of Christianity. The first one had been led by barons, so it was felt to be like, oh wow, Conrad wasn't Holy Roman. He never became Holy Roman Emperor. He was only he arrived only to King of the Romans, but he was still conceived as an emperor. So basically, this expedition was led by in this sense the King of the Romans. So basically the emperor, and then by Louis VII, King of France. So kind of the biggest guys in Europe at the time, and it was obviously seen as something so great that it would have had to bring victory in any case. But it was a terrible disaster instead. The Second Crusade was basically, it obtained no result. And part of this reason was seemingly attached to Conrad's poor leadership. Conrad was, in the fashion of that time, a good knight, actually, but it doesn't take to be, you can be a good knight, but you also should be a good commander, which seemingly he wasn't. And he brought actually the Crusader army to be defeated in Dorilium in 1148 by taking the mainland path through Anatolia instead of passing through the coast and receiving help. Even though I kind of started that story because this happened at the time of the Komnenians. I remember this exam. It's not really clear what happened. Sometimes we are eager to give certain judgments as if, yeah, Conrad of Swabia was kind of a bad, incapable commander. But, what do you really feel to be in the place of criticizing a medieval knight of the 12th century, without not even having fought into a battle or stuff? I mean, we don't really know, and sources can be interpreted in many ways. But generally speaking, this is given as at least this is what the sources say. Then reality might be another thing, but Conrad was definitely seen as responsible for this major defeat. Louis VII also, he kind of got out of there a bit better, in the sense that it's not that he accomplished much either, but he at least was seen as more as a kind of pilgrim in that sense, because theoretically he was following Conrad. Here, the King of France was definitely more powerful than Conrad, I think, already at this time. But still, the German king was a step above, at least ideally, as he had to be crowned emperor sooner or later. So Louis VII kind of got out as the pious pilgrim king that went to the Holy Land, and he remained humble in all this. The French court at this time was very highly spiritual, very very much into kind of a stern lifestyle based on Christian ideals and all. The Germans were considered a bit more the guys who had to be in trust of military affairs, of leading. I mean, the imperial figure was really meant to lead, to bear the sword, to defend, to fight, and the shame of Damascus was terrible. The Crusaders' assault on the city of Damascus failed because the expedition had gone on after Dorilium, and they got away without having nothing accomplished. By the way, this crusade was also joined by Conrad's nephew, Frederick, who was son of his older brother. Yes, Frederick. That in turn he had not been elected because he lost an eye. And the laws of the time required physical integrity to rise to kingship, and at that time Frederick Hohenstaufen really worked hard for providing his son Frederick, eventually Frederick Barbarossa, the necessary basis for expanding, while his brother Conrad was ruling de facto. So Frederick Barbarossa was still there with his uncle in the crusade, and he proved a very valid fighter. As we know, Frederick I was a great warrior as well, and as well as a great military leader eventually. And so when Conrad eventually passed away, the German nobility decided to solve the situation by electing Frederick as his successor, because now he had become Duke of Swabia after his dad's passing, and he seemed a very fit ruler, and he had joined his uncle in the crusade, as we've seen. He was a very energetic and strong man, So he was really a good leader, and especially he also descended. He was on Hohenstaufen indeed, but he also descended from the Welfen, from his mother's side, and from the Dukes of Bavaria. So he was seen fit in order to kind of pacify finally the Welfs and the Ghibellines, and this was a plus. And in fact, when he was elected king. He carried out a wise politics, indeed, wise policies of kind of that had to reconciliate the two sides, so trying to keep things in order, trying at least, and achieving in part, indeed, too. That came to him basically from the fact of allowing the German nobility enough space, which from one side was positive if you wanted to be elected, and basically the only mean, because those who elected you didn't want you to mess up to mess their business up. But at the same time, it was definitely a problem in the sense that increasing the power of the nobility also equated to reduce the one of the monarchy. So Frederick, as we will see, I made a video about the first years of Frederick Barbarossa as a ruler. So if you want to see how it continues, you can kind of go look at that. The major balance in internal affairs into Germany at this point was really about the relation between Frederick and his very powerful cousin Henry, also known as Henry the Lion, who basically managed to reunite in his own hands the duchies of Saxony and Bavaria. So becoming very dangerous for the Swabian-Franconian axis, or Franconian bloc, as you can want to call it, and this created problems also into the history, let's say, in the policy of Frederick eventually, because his cousin rebelled, and there were I will have to talk about that anymore. I think just I'm going let's say by tiny bits about German history now, because I really want not to put too much on in the oven. Let's say maybe I should speed up, but I stop here. I will have to talk extensively about Frederick Barbarossa in my own future videos, and definitely because it's a complicated story. You can't really tell it as, oh yeah, this happens and so on. I mean, I feel I already simplify too much when I talk about these topics. So let's stop here now. So as always, I hope that you liked this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel for receiving further contents. And for now, I thank you as always heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.